Imagine this. Nothing dramatic, just an ordinary weekday. You wake up, check your phone. Your balance is low, but not zero. Enough to survive, not enough to fix problems. On the way to work, something feels off. A strange sound, a warning sign you don't fully understand. You tell yourself, not today, because today's problem costs a few $100s, and you don't have it. So you delay. And here's the part most people miss. Delaying isn't free. It's interest, just not the kind banks charge. Weeks pass, the small issue grows quietly. Stress increases, options disappear. When it finally breaks, it doesn't ask politely. Now you're paying. For emergency service, for larger damage, for lost time, for missed income. What could have been manageable becomes overwhelming. Not because you were careless, not because you were lazy, but because you didn't have margin. This is the real tax on being broke. Money doesn't just buy things, it buys timing. It lets you solve problems early when they are cheap. Without money, every problem waits. And problems that wait almost always grow. That's why people feel stuck even when they work harder. They're not falling behind because of bad decisions. They're trapped in a system where small shortages create big consequences. This isn't motivation. This is math. And until you build financial margin, life will keep charging you penalties for being late. Today isn't about stocks, it isn't about crypto, and it definitely isn't about getting rich fast. Today is about something quieter and far more dangerous. The cost of not having money. Most financial advice starts with blame. Be disciplined. Cut small expenses. Skip coffee. Cancel subscriptions. As if poverty is a personality flaw. But that story collapses the moment you look at the math. Because wealth isn't just about behavior, it's about access. Here's the problem no budget tip can solve. When you don't have money, you don't get to buy the best option. You're forced to buy the cheapest option available. And cheap options don't save money. They rent it from the future. Imagine two people buying the same thing. One can afford quality. They pay once. It lasts. The other can't. They pay less today, but again tomorrow, and again next year. Over time, the cheaper choice costs more. Not because it's unfair, but because it's fragile. This is the hidden rule of money. Durability is expensive up front and cheap in the long run. Fragility is cheap up front and brutally expensive over time. So the person without money pays more for shoes, more for repairs, more for emergencies, more for mistakes. Not because they choose to, but because they have no margin. This is what people miss when they say, just save better. You can't optimize your way out of structural disadvantage. This isn't laziness. It's not bad habits. It's a system where lack of capital carries interest. And that interest is paid in stress, instability, and constant replacement. That's the real cost of being broke. You're not buying worse things. You're buying them over and over again. At this point, you might be wondering, fine, I get the theory, but what does this actually look like in real life? The answer is uncomfortable. It looks normal. It's hiding in everyday decisions you don't even notice. Take something boring, household basics. If you have spare cash, you buy in bulk. One trip, one payment, lowest price. If you don't, you buy in fragments, small packs, higher unit cost, more trips, more time, more money just spread out. Same product, same quality, different price. Not because of choice, because of liquidity. When money is tight, you're locked out of scale. You don't pay more because you're careless. You pay more because you can't afford efficiency. That's the poverty premium, and it quietly raises your personal inflation rate. But groceries are the soft version of this problem. The hard version lives in institutions. Look at how the system treats you based on balance alone. With savings, you're low risk. Fees disappear. Rules bend. Service improves. Without savings, every mistake becomes billable. One small misstep, one timing issue, one forgotten charge, and suddenly you're paying penalties that are larger than the original problem. You didn't borrow money, but you're charged like you did. For a tiny shortfall, you're hit with fees so extreme they would be illegal anywhere else. And notice the pattern. People with money earn interest. People without money pay it. Not occasionally, systematically. This isn't random. It's not personal. It's a silent transfer from instability to stability, from stress to surplus. And once you see it, you realize something important. Being broke isn't just hard, it's structurally expensive. At this point, some people push back. They say, then just don't spend money you don't have. And on paper, that sounds correct. But real life doesn't run on spreadsheets. It runs on brains under pressure. When money becomes uncertain, your mind changes how it operates. Not metaphorically, literally. Scarcity narrows attention. When survival is the problem, everything else gets downgraded. Your brain stops planning years ahead and starts solving hours ahead. That's not weakness. That's biology. Under constant financial stress, decision-making becomes short-term by force. This is why people under pressure choose options that look irrational from the outside. High-interest loans, desperate shortcuts, comfort over optimization. Not because they don't understand consequences, but because their mental capacity is already fully occupied. Scarcity doesn't just empty wallets, it consumes bandwidth. And that's the missing layer most explanations ignore. This isn't just about spending more money, it's about spending more attention. When you can afford reliability, you stop thinking about basic failures. When you can't, every small thing becomes a potential crisis. That constant vigilance has a cost. It drains the energy that could have gone into learning, improving, planning, escaping the loop. Which brings us to a much larger example, transportation. In many places, a car isn't a luxury, it's permission to earn. If you have savings and decent credit, you buy stability, something reliable, predictable costs, low friction. The car quietly does its job and disappears from your mental space. But if you're starting with nothing, you don't buy transportation. You buy risk on wheels, high payments, high interest, constant breakdown anxiety. Not because you want to, but because there's no other doorway into work. And once again, notice the pattern. The expensive option isn't the better one. It's the only one available. And it doesn't just cost more money, it costs peace of mind. The real divide isn't intelligence, it isn't effort. It's who gets to offload worry and who has to carry it every day. That's why escaping poverty is so hard. You're not just climbing out financially, you're climbing out mentally, while still running the race. And here's where the trap fully reveals itself. The car doesn't just cost more, it breaks before you're done paying for it. So now you're making payments on something that no longer works while trying to survive long enough to replace it. That's not bad budgeting, that's compound pressure. You're charged extra because you're labeled risky, but the only way to stop being risky is to already have money, which means the penalty never stops. This is the defining feature of poverty. You don't just lack money, you pay a premium for lacking it. And this logic doesn't stop at transportation. Housing turns it brutal. When you rent, every payment disappears. No equity, no ownership, no future leverage. You're paying for shelter and funding someone else's asset. But buying requires savings. Savings require leftover money. Leftover money doesn't exist when rent eats half your income. So the person with capital pays less each month and builds wealth. The person without capital pays more and builds nothing. Same roof, different math. Being poor means renting everything, your home, your money through interest, your stability through fees. And there's one more cost people almost never count. Time. If you own appliances, tasks fade into the background. If you don't, every task expands. Travel, waiting, coordination, recovery. Each errand becomes an event. When you lack money, life has friction everywhere. And friction steals hours. Hours steal energy. Energy steals progress. That's how poverty taxes the future. Now, this is where people shut down, because this sounds hopeless, like the rules are rigged, and honestly, they are. But understanding the structure is how you find the exit, because the solution isn't get rich fast. That advice misses the point. The first objective isn't growth, it's damage control. If you're paying 18%, 25%, 30% interest, that's not a side issue. That's the battlefield. Paying that off isn't boring. It's the highest guaranteed return available. If a $50 purchase prevents 5 future $15 replacements, that's not spending. That's closing a leak. This is the shift. Stop asking, can I afford this today? Start asking, what does this cost me over its lifetime? The system wants you focused on monthly payments. That's how the real cost stays hidden. You need to think like a CFO, not a consumer. Which brings us to the most important weapon, the buffer. That first small pile of cash, $500, $1,000, changes everything. It turns emergencies into inconveniences. It removes desperation from decisions. It lowers insurance costs. It blocks payday loans. It unlocks bulk pricing. It buys time. Money saved doesn't just sit there. It actively reduces future expenses. That's the paradox no one explains. The buffer is hard to build because it's built under pressure. But once it exists, the game flips. You move from defense to offense. So here's the actionable step. And it's not glamorous. Audit your life for poverty penalties. Where are you paying extra only because you're stretched thin? High interest debt, late fees, disposable replacements, convenience pricing. Pick the single biggest leak, then cut everything else until that leak is sealed. Extra income isn't hustle culture here. It's a tactical strike. Fixing the problem permanently beats treating the symptom every month. This isn't about deprivation. It's about escape velocity. Because once you stop paying the poor tax, every dollar works harder. Every decision gets easier. Every month compounds forward instead of resetting. The climb is unfair. The first steps are the steepest. But once you see the math clearly, you stop blaming yourself and start dismantling the penalties. You stop renting survival. You start owning stability. That's the real upgrade. Not luxury, not status, not appearances. Margin. If this made you see your own finances differently, share it with someone who's stuck in the same loop. We talk a lot about success. We don't talk enough about the traps. And until we do, people keep buying cheap boots and wondering why the ground never dries.